How do you stop a freight train in 1875? The engineer cannot stop it. The locomotive has no brakes that reach beyond the engine and the tender. The 30 or 40 or 50 freight cars behind the engine have no connection to the locomotive's braking system. Each car has its own brake, operated by its own wheel, mounted on its own roof, 12 to 14 feet above the track. To stop the train, the engineer blows the whistle. The whistle is the signal. When the brakemen hear the whistle, they climb from whatever position they are in on the platform at the end of the car, in the caboose, on a plank between two boxcars, and they begin to run across the rooftops, car by car, 40 feet at a time. Leaping the gap between each car, they reach the brake wheel and turn it with their hands and a wooden club used for leverage. The head brakeman starts at the engine and works backward. The rear brakeman, the flagman, starts at the caboose and works forward. They meet somewhere in the middle of a train that may be a quarter-mile long, having turned every wheel on every car while the train is moving beneath them, and the train slows and stops. That is the procedure in daylight, on dry wood, in calm weather. The procedure does not change in the dark. It does not change in the rain. It does not change in the snow or on ice, or in fog, or in a crosswind, or on a curve, where the centrifugal force rolls the cars and magnifies every motion 14 feet above the track. The brakeman runs the same roofs, leaps the same gaps, turns the same wheels. The only difference is that in the dark, in the rain, on ice, the brakeman cannot see the edge of the car, and his boots slip on the wet wood, and the brake club does not grip the frozen wheel, and the gap between the cars is 2 feet wide and 14 feet deep, and the rail is directly below it, and the wheels of the car behind him are rolling at 30 miles per hour directly beneath the gap where he is about to fall. When the brakeman slipped, he fell between the cars. The steel wheels of the trailing car passed over his body. The railroading journals of the 1870s and the 1880s described the result in a phrase that appeared so often it became a standard entry in accident reports: cut in two. The brakeman who fell between the cars was cut in two by the wheels. The train continued until the remaining brakemen could stop it. The body was retrieved from the track. The phrase appeared again in the next report, and the next, and the next. I went looking for the records. What I found was not a machine that failed. It was a machine that worked exactly as designed, in an industry that employed more people than any other business in the United States, run by the wealthiest family in the country, in which the technology to prevent the deaths had been patented, tested, and proven 6 years before the first brakeman in this story died, and the companies that owned the railroads refused to buy it for 24 years, while the brakemen kept dying on the roofs. The freight car rooftops that the brakemen ran across were not designed for human traffic. The roofs of boxcars were planked with rough-sawn lumber. The roofs of flat cars were open. The roofs of stock cars, which carried livestock, were slatted with gaps through which animal waste and heat rose and coated the walking surface. Most freight cars had a narrow running board, a single plank or a pair of planks, laid along the center of the roof from one end to the other, intended as a walkway. The running board was between 12 and 18 inches wide. It was nailed to the roof timbers and exposed to every element. In summer, the wood dried and splintered. In winter, it froze and became as smooth as glass. In rain, it was slick with water and coal soot from the locomotive's exhaust. The brakeman walked and ran on this surface at a height of 12 to 14 feet above the track, on a platform that was itself in motion, swaying with the irregularities of the rail joints and the curves at speeds of 20 to 40 miles per hour. The gaps between freight cars were the killing ground. The cars were coupled with link and pin couplers that allowed several inches of play in both the horizontal and the vertical plane. The gap between two coupled freight cars was roughly 2 feet wide, but it was not stable. The cars shifted relative to each other as the train moved, opening and closing the gap unpredictably. A brakeman, leaping from one car roof to the next, had to time his jump to the motion of both cars simultaneously, and if either car lurched or shifted at the moment he was in the air, his landing point moved with it. A misjudgment of 6 inches put his boot on the edge of the running board instead of the center. A misjudgment of 12 inches put him in the gap. The railroads that operated through mountainous terrain or through regions with tunnels and bridges added another category of hazard. Tunnels on the New York Central's routes and on competing lines were unventilated. When a coal-burning locomotive entered a tunnel, the exhaust filled the bore with thick black smoke and live steam that reduced visibility to zero. The brakeman riding on the roof of a freight car entering a tunnel could not see the tunnel walls, could not see the overhead clearance, could not see the other cars ahead of him, and could not breathe. If the tunnel had a low clearance point, the brakeman had to flatten himself on the running board or be struck by the tunnel ceiling. Bridges with overhead trusses presented the same hazard. The brakeman, who was standing upright on the roof when the train passed under a low bridge truss, was struck in the head or chest by the steel beam and killed instantly, or swept off the car and into the river or ravine below. The phrase for this category of death was struck by overhead obstruction. It appeared in the accident reports alongside cut in two and fell from train. On long freight trains, a third brakeman, the middle brakeman, was stationed in the center of the consist, riding on the roof in the open air for the entire duration of the run, in every weather condition, so that he would be in position to begin setting brakes from the middle of the train without having to run the full distance from either end. The middle brakeman had no shelter. He sat or stood on the running board of a freight car for hours at a time, exposed to wind, rain, snow, coal smoke, and the constant rolling motion of the car. In winter, on the routes across upstate New York and along the Lake Erie shoreline, the wind chill on the roof of a moving freight car could reach temperatures that would cause frostbite within minutes. The middle brakeman's job was to endure this exposure and be ready to move when the whistle blew. The railroading journals published poems with the title "Only a Brakeman," a phrase that appeared so frequently in the press and in the labor publications of the era that it became a cultural shorthand for the expendability of the men who worked the roofs. The Locomotive Engineer's Journal published one such poem in 1885. The title tells you everything you need to know about how the industry viewed the men who did this work. In 1883, the brakemen organized. The Brotherhood of Railroad Brakemen was established in Oneonta, New York, on the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad by a group of brakemen who understood that the conditions they were working under were not going to change unless they forced the change themselves. The Brotherhood pushed for safety legislation, for better pay, for shorter hours, and for the adoption of the automatic air brake and the automatic coupler that would eliminate the two most lethal tasks in their occupation. The railroads resisted. The costs were cited. The Brotherhood was young and its political power was limited. The brakemen kept dying on the roofs. Cornelius Vanderbilt did not start in railroads. He started on the water. Born on Staten Island on May 27, 1794, the son of a farmer and boatman, Vanderbilt left school before he turned 12 and began working the ferries and cargo boats of New York Harbor. By the age of 18, he was carrying freight and passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan on his own vessel. By the 1830s, he controlled most of the ferry and coastal shipping routes in the New York Harbor area. By the 1850s, he operated steamship lines that carried passengers from the East Coast to California via Nicaragua during the gold rush, making enormous profits from the demand for passage and earning the title Commodore, not from the Navy, but from the scale and aggression of his commercial fleet. He was the richest man in the American shipping industry before he ever bought a share of railroad stock. Vanderbilt entered the railroad business in the 1860s at the age of 70. He acquired the New York and Harlem Railroad in 1862 and 1863. He acquired the Hudson River Railroad in 1864. He took control of the New York Central Railroad in 1867 after a stock manipulation campaign that drove down the Central's share price until the existing directors had no choice but to sell. In 1869, he merged the New York Central and the Hudson River Railroad into a single system. In 1871, he added the Michigan Central. In 1873, he added the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern Railway, connecting Buffalo to Chicago. Cornelius Vanderbilt now controlled the first continuous rail line from New York City to Chicago, running along the water level route of the Hudson River Valley, the Mohawk Valley, and the southern shore of Lake Erie. The New York Central's water level route was its competitive advantage. While other railroads had to climb the Appalachian grades, the Central followed river valleys and lake shorelines, avoiding steep climbs, reducing fuel costs, and allowing higher average speeds. Higher speeds meant more freight moved per year. More freight meant more revenue. More revenue meant more trains. More trains meant more brakemen on more roofs, running more frequently to slow trains that were moving faster than any freight operation in the country. In 1871, Vanderbilt built Grand Central Depot at 42nd Street in Manhattan, consolidating the terminal operations of his New York and Harlem, Hudson River, and New York Central lines into a single monumental station with a facade 150 feet long and a train shed that was one of the largest enclosed structures in the city. The station was the visible symbol of the Vanderbilt Empire and the origin point for the freight and passenger traffic that stretched 1,000 miles to the west. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died on January 4, 1877, he left a fortune of approximately $100 million, the largest private fortune in the United States at that time. At the moment of his death, the Vanderbilt Railroad system employed more people than any other business enterprise in the country. His son, William Henry Vanderbilt, inherited the empire and expanded it aggressively. William added the New York, West Shore, and Buffalo Railroad in 1885. Under his management, the New York Central system grew to 10,000 miles of track linking New York City with Boston, Montreal, Chicago, and St. Louis. In 1882, a reporter asked William Henry Vanderbilt whether the New York Central ran its trains for the benefit of the public. His response entered the American lexicon. He said, "The public be damned. I am working for my stockholders." William Henry Vanderbilt died on December 8, 1885, 8 years after his father, leaving a fortune that had nearly doubled to approximately $200 million. The Vanderbilt fortune was built on freight. The New York Central was a freight railroad first and a passenger railroad second. Freight is where the revenue was. Freight is where the volume was, and freight is where the brakemen died, because passenger cars had been equipped with Westinghouse automatic air brakes and enclosed vestibule platforms and safety railings years before the freight cars that generated the revenue that built Grand Central and funded the Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue and the family mausoleum on Staten Island. The freight brakeman rode on the roof, the passenger brakeman rode inside the car. The difference between the two was not a technical limitation, it was a cost decision. Passenger safety was a public relations requirement because a dead passenger generated lawsuits and newspaper headlines. Freight safety was an operating expense because a dead brakeman generated a line item in an accident report and a replacement was hired the following week. If the records from this era interest you, the accident statistics that the Interstate Commerce Commission published starting in 1889 are the most comprehensive source on railroad worker deaths in the 19th century. The numbers are there. Don't take my word for it. Look at what the evidence shows, and subscribe if you want to see where the next thread leads. The machine that killed the brakeman was not the locomotive. It was not the freight car. It was the brake wheel on the roof. A cast iron wheel, roughly 18 inches in diameter, connected by a vertical shaft and a chain mechanism to brake shoes on the car's wheels below. The brakeman turned the wheel by hand, or by using a brake club, a wooden bar roughly 2 feet long that he inserted into the spokes of the wheel for leverage. The wheel required approximately 125 pounds of force applied at the rim to set the brake shoe against the car's wheel with enough friction to slow the car. 125 pounds applied by a man standing on a running board 14 feet above the rails, on a moving train, at night, in weather, using a wooden club for leverage on a cast iron wheel that might be frozen solid, rusted in place, or jammed with debris. 1 wheel per car, 30 to 50 cars per train. 2 to 5 brakemen per train, advancing from opposite ends, leaping the 2-foot gaps between cars, turning the wheels, working toward each other until every brake on every car had been set, and the friction had accumulated enough to slow a train that weighed hundreds of tons and had no other means of stopping. The brakeman's career was measured physically. Railroad workers in the 1870s and the 1880s assessed a man's experience in the freight yards and on the main line by counting his fingers. The Lincoln pin coupler, the device that connected freight cars to each other, required a man to stand between 2 approaching cars and drop a heavy iron pin into the coupling mechanism as the car buffers closed together. If his timing was off by a fraction of a second, the iron loops of the coupler took his fingers. If his timing was off by a full second, the coupler took his hand. If his footing slipped on the gravel and cinders between the rails, the buffer plates crushed his arm or his chest or his skull. A veteran brakeman with all 10 fingers was either very new to the job or very lucky. The missing fingers were the resume. I covered the link and pin coupler in a previous video on this channel, and the men who operated it deserve every word of that script. But today's story is about the roofs, not the couplers, the brake wheel and the running board and the gap between the cars. The journals published the numbers. In the 1880s, railroad worker deaths in the United States were second only to coal miners. An estimated 20,000 to 30,000 railroad workers were maimed or killed per year during the 1870s and the 1880s, according to the account published in American Heritage from the records of Lorenzo Coffin, the Iowa State Railroad Commissioner who spent 2 decades fighting for safety legislation. The train man, as American Heritage described him, had one of the most hazardous peacetime occupations on Earth. By 1893, the year Congress finally acted, the estimated death toll for that single year was over 3,000 railroad workers killed on the job. Coupling accidents alone accounted for nearly 11,000 injuries and deaths in 1892. The comparative data compiled by the ICC showed that American railroad workers died at rates vastly exceeding those of their British counterparts because American railroads were built cheaply, signaled poorly, ran longer freight trains at higher speeds, and used manual brakes and link and pin couplers that British railroads had already replaced. The technology to prevent most of these deaths existed before the worst of them occurred. George Westinghouse patented the automatic air brake in 1869, 6 years before the period covered by the worst of the New York Central's accident records. The air brake used compressed air, generated by a steam-driven pump on the locomotive, distributed through a continuous pipe running beneath the entire length of the train, to apply brake shoes on every car simultaneously when the engineer pulled a single lever in the cab. The engineer could stop the train from the locomotive. No brakeman needed to climb the roof. No brakeman needed to run from car to car in the dark. No brakeman needed to leap the gaps. No brakeman needed the brake club or the cast iron wheel or the frozen running board. The air brake eliminated the most dangerous task in American industry at the time it was being performed. But the early Westinghouse air brake had a limitation. It worked reliably on passenger trains, which were shorter and lighter, but it did not work reliably on long, heavy freight trains. The compressed air lost pressure over the length of a 50-car freight consist, and the rearmost cars did not receive enough pressure to set their brakes effectively. Westinghouse spent nearly 2 decades refining the system. He developed the triple valve, which allowed each car's brake cylinder to hold its own reservoir of compressed air and apply independently when the main line pressure dropped. By 1887, the improved system worked on long freight trains. The test that proved it was arranged by Lorenzo Coffin. Coffin was a farmer, a Civil War veteran who had served with the 32nd Iowa Infantry, and an Iowa State Railroad Commissioner who had witnessed a brakeman fall from the roof of a freight car and be crushed under the wheels. That single death changed the direction of Coffin's life. He began investigating railroad safety, talking to brakemen and conductors and engineers across Iowa, and what he learned appalled him. The safety devices existed. Westinghouse had the air brake. Eli Janney had patented an automatic knuckle coupler that locked like 2 hands clasping, eliminating the need for a man to stand between the cars with an iron pin. The technology was available. The railroads would not buy it. In 1886 and 1887, Coffin arranged a series of tests of the Westinghouse freight air brake. The early tests failed. The brake did not perform as needed on the test trains. Coffin did not give up. He scheduled another test on a long descending grade outside Burlington, Iowa. A Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy steam locomotive was coupled to 50 loaded freight cars. The train started downgrade and accelerated. When it reached 40 miles per hour, the engineer pulled the air brake lever in the locomotive cab. The 50-car freight train shuddered along its entire length and came to a dead stop within 500 feet, with scarcely a jar. No brakeman climbed a roof. No one turned a wheel, no one leaped a gap, no one touched a brake club. Lorenzo Coffin, the gaunt old farmer and Civil War veteran, stood at the trackside watching the train stop and wept. "I am the happiest man in all creation," he said. The railroads did not adopt the air brake voluntarily. The brake worked. The test proved it. The technology was ready. But the brake cost money. Every freight car in the United States would have to be retrofitted with an air line, a brake cylinder, a triple valve, and a compressed air reservoir. The railroads calculated the cost of the retrofit against the cost of the brakemen who were dying without it, and the brakemen lost the calculation. A dead brakeman cost the company nothing. No lawsuit, no settlement, no liability. The brakeman's family received whatever the company chose to offer, which was usually nothing. The air brake cost real money applied to every car on every train on every route. The railroads chose the option that cost less. The brakemen continued to die. Coffin drafted the first Railroad Safety Appliance Act and saw it passed into law by the Iowa State Legislature in 1890. The Iowa law required all trains operating within the state to be equipped with automatic air brakes and automatic couplers. The railroads that operated across state lines argued that a state law could not compel them to retrofit interstate freight cars. The Iowa law was ignored. Coffin turned his campaign to the federal government. He spoke across the country. He wrote letters. He testified before committees. He organized demonstrations. He pressured every congressman and senator he could reach. In 1889 and 1890, the newly formed Interstate Commerce Commission published its first comprehensive accident statistics, and the numbers confirmed everything Coffin had been saying for 20 years. The data showed conclusively and publicly the extraordinary risk to trainmen from coupling and from riding freight. The numbers were official, the numbers were undeniable. The American public, and more importantly the American press, now had access to the body count. On March 2, 1893, President Benjamin Harrison signed the Railroad Safety Appliance Act into law. The act required all railroads in the United States to equip their trains with automatic air brakes and automatic couplers. The railroads were given a 7-year grace period to comply. 7 more years. George Westinghouse had patented the air brake in 1869. Congress mandated it in 1893. The mandate did not take effect until 1900, 31 years between the patent and the enforcement. In those 31 years, by the lowest available estimates, tens of thousands of brakemen died on the roofs of freight cars, turning brake wheels that the air brake had made unnecessary before the first of them climbed the ladder. By the highest estimates, the number of railroad workers killed or permanently maimed during the gap between Westinghouse's patent and Congress's enforcement exceeded 300,000. The effect of the Safety Appliance Act, when it finally took hold after 1900, was immediate and dramatic. Coupling accidents dropped from nearly 11,000 in 1892 to just over 2,000 in 1902, a reduction of more than 80%, even as the total number of railroad employees increased steadily during the same decade. The rooftop deaths declined with the same speed and the same finality. The AIR brake did exactly what it had been designed to do in 1869. It stopped the train from the locomotive cab. The brakeman no longer needed to climb the roof. The brake club was no longer needed. The running board was no longer a workplace. The cast iron wheel on the roof of the freight car became a backup system, used only when the air brake failed, which was rarely. The most dangerous peacetime occupation in the United States became, within a few years of the Act's enforcement, a job that a man could survive for an entire career. I started with a question: how do you stop a freight train in 1875? The answer is that you send a man across the roof, in the dark, in the rain, on ice, 14 feet above the rails, leaping 2-foot gaps between freight cars traveling at 30 miles per hour, turning cast iron brake wheels by hand with a wooden club, car by car, 30 to 50 cars per train, while the train passes through unventilated tunnels filled with coal smoke and under-bridge trusses that will kill him if he is standing upright when the truss passes overhead. And when the man slips because the roof is wet, because the ice has formed on the running board, because the curve threw him off balance, because the brake wheel was frozen and he pulled too hard on the club and his footing shifted, the man falls between the cars and the wheels cut him in two, and the accident report lists him as one more entry in the column that has been filling since the railroad started running freight. The technology to stop these deaths was patented in 1869 by George Westinghouse. It was tested and proven in 1887 on a grade outside Burlington, Iowa, in front of Lorenzo Coffin, who wept watching it work. It was mandated by Congress in 1893 and enforced in 1900. In the 31-year gap between the patent and the enforcement, the Vanderbilt family built the New York Central into a 10,000-mile system that linked New York to Chicago and employed more workers than any other business in the country. And the brakemen who operated that system died on the roofs of the freight cars that generated the revenue that built Grand Central Depot and the Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue and the family mausoleum on Staten Island. Cornelius Vanderbilt's fortunate death was $100 million. His son William nearly doubled it. William told a reporter, "The public be damned. He was working for his stockholders." The brakemen who died on the New York Central are listed in the company's employee records and in the Interstate Commerce Commission accident statistics published after 1889. They are not listed on any wall of Grand Central Terminal. They are not named in any Vanderbilt family history. The column in the accident report where they appear is labeled with a number, not a name. The records are in the Interstate Commerce Commission archives, in the accident reports, in the county coroner's files along the New York Central's water level route from Manhattan to Chicago. Lorenzo Coffin's testimony is in the congressional record. The Westinghouse air brake patent is in the United States Patent Office. The evidence is there. The brakemen are not. There are more of these stories. More machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different or did not come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how a horse walking in circles pulled 2 million stumps from the American prairie and the cable that did the pulling killed the men who stood over it, that video is on screen now.